Welcome to the Better Podcast, where you and I get better in this game called life. I'm Chin, your co-host today, and I co-founded The Smart Investor, an investment site where we talk about stocks all day.
And I'm your co-host Ser Jing. I run the Good Investors investment blog and a global equities investment fund together with my friend Jeremy Chia. Now, before we start, here's a disclaimer. Nothing on this show should be taken as investment advice. It is purely for informational and entertainment purposes only. All opinions expressed in this show by us and our guests are solely our own opinions. We and our guests may hold positions in the financial assets discussed in the show, and these holdings are subject to change at any time.
Hello. We are in episode number 10 of the Better Podcast. I think that we maybe didn't think that we'll get here so fast, but here we are. And it's 15th of July. Good evening or good morning to wherever you are. And again, I'm here with Ser Jing, and we're gonna talk about things which are not planned ahead of time. So, what do you have for us today, Ser Jing?
Yep, I would like to actually talk about the rail industry in the US. So that would be trains that are moving products and sometimes passengers. So I was reading this really interesting article with the title of America's Freight Railroads Are Incredibly Chaotic Right Now. Right,
Really?
so that was
Okay.
so that was just published yesterday, and it essentially talks about the huge lack of workers for the freight industry or the rail industry, and what was a big reason for that. So just to give you some perspective, right? Union Pacific, which is one of the larger railroads in the US, it has about 30,000 employees today, but 5 years ago it actually had 42,000 employees. Right, so that's a big decline in number of employees in 5 years' time, and I think that situation is probably similar across some of the other larger railroads in the US, right? And so in that article, it mentioned that one of the big reasons why this is so is because of a particular practice that have only recently been adopted widely in the freight industry, and that is precision scheduled railroading. Right. So what I learned about,
I think that practice has been around for a while. It's by a very I can't remember
Hunter Harrison.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah, Hunter Harrison. So Hunter Harrison was like the first executive who kind of created that whole model. So in the past, before Hunter Harrison created precision scheduled railroading or PSR, railroads would actually wait in their stations for their customers to come with the products, and then when the products arrive, the trains would start moving off. But with PSR, they changed the whole dynamic. So instead of the trains waiting for customers, it would be the customers having to match the schedules of trains. So Hunter Harrison built this model in 2 Canadian railroads that he was leading, and they did really well in terms of growing revenues and profits and so on. But behind the scenes, apparently, according to the 2019 Wall Street Journal article that I'll be linking to in the show notes, the customers of the railroads that Hunter Harrison was serving actually faced a lot of operational problems, and these operational problems actually cascaded to other railroad operators as well. So it created kind of a big mess within the industry. And I think, according to the 2 articles that I mentioned just now, about most of the railroad companies in the US started adopting PSR in recent years.
Yes.
Yeah. So that has created a lot of problems. And one of the interesting things about PSR is that it allows the railroads to hire lesser people because they are able to increase the efficiency of their operations. Right. But the problem is that now they are facing a shortage of workers. Even though they are able to, with usage of PSR, they're able to reduce the amount of employees that they can hire. But now they are also still facing shortage of workers. But the problem is that this shortage of workers has also now created a lot of other problems for the railroads, and that comes in the form of like the lack of ability to maintain and service the trains and the trucks. Right. And so when I was reading this article, I had this thought in mind, which is that PSRs to me seems like it's the railroads really trying to optimize for efficiency.
Right.
Right. And I think that optimizing for efficiency oftentimes comes, the trade-off that companies will have to make is lacking the ability or lacking some form of buffer
Mm-hmm.
to handle external shocks. So what happened with PSR is that for the railroads, when COVID happened, they lost a lot of workers, even more workers than they were
Okay.
already naturally firing,
Mm-hmm.
and they were unable to hire these people back as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's in a situation where like where now they are in serious lack of employees to be able to maintain and service their
Mm-hmm.
operations, and so they are in effect, when faced with an external big impact, they were
Mm-hmm.
unable to, their operations were not as resilient. And that was a result of the adoption of PSR, which is trying to optimize for efficiency. So I think this is a kind of a microcosm of a general idea that when more and more industries try to optimize for efficiency, the
Mm-hmm.
trade-off is that um, society as a whole, or the business environment as a whole, has now a lower ability to withstand shocks.
Mm-hmm.
And this ties back to the idea of, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this concept called anti-fragile.
Yes. But
Yes, you
for the
are.
benefit of the listeners, I think it might be good for you to explain.
Yeah, sure. So, anti-fragile is a concept that I learned from Nassim Taleb, and he first described it in his book titled Anti-Fragile.
Mm-hmm.
And according to Taleb, systems, organisms, and objects can be classified into three categories: the fragile, the robust, and the anti-fragile. Robust things, systems, organisms, they break when exposed to stress. So,
Mm-hmm.
like a piece of glass, if you drop it on the floor, it cracks and breaks.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a fragile object. A robust object would be one that is that will remain unchanged when exposed to stress. So that would be like a football, right? You kick the football, that's
Mm-hmm.
exposure to stress, but it remains unchanged. And the human body is a good example of an anti-fragile organism or system, because when we exercise, we're exposing our bodies to stress, but we come out from the exercise stronger, right? So the idea is that there are certain, perhaps, organizations that can be robust, that can be fragile or anti-fragile. And I think that when companies tend to optimize for efficiency, they end up sacrificing some elements of resilience or anti-fragility. And yeah, so with that, I would pause and I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So the first thought I had was really that this staff shortage problem. My feeling is that it's not just and I cheated because I went to Google, right? I don't think it's like train specific problem, because if I think if you look at probably aviation, hotels, basically any industry which was like tremendously hit during COVID. When I say COVID, I'm talking about the period of time, probably around 1.5 years to 1 to 3/4 years, starting from 2020, right? I think that period was a time where uh, a lot of companies really had to cut down, right? So if you are a restaurant and if your sales just plummet by 50% or even more, then obviously you have to take really drastic actions to cut down on your staff count and so on. Otherwise, the entire company won't survive. And if it doesn't, then there's nobody's gonna be happy, right? So I think that what I'm seeing is also in the aviation industry, there's also a huge lack of staff. I think that within Singapore, we are seeing that there's a lot of stress on hotels and F&B as well. And I think to the extent that this, in a way, um, it, it, if I go off on a tangent here, I think this is sort of a broader in my mind, sort of impact which we are seeing from COVID itself. Because for me, the ripples of what happened during COVID are so drastic, and if you just take any one, event, say, cutting off the causeway, for example, the impacts of that decision for almost 2 years, I think we're only beginning to understand that sort of impact and what's happening. Inflation, in part, is also part of all this, right? Because um, you have a period of time where people are forced to stay home, they have nowhere to spend their money, and now you have all these industries cutting down on their staff, on their capacity, and when everyone's released out into the wild again, they start spending. It drives up demand. All these businesses, they cannot catch up, and I think that's why, in my very simple mind, why inflation is happening as well. So I think that this is it's not it I won't I think it's not unusual. It typically happens after a recession, but on the other hand, perhaps because of COVID and how drastic the changes are, the inflation bit becomes much more pronounced compared to the past recessions. I'm speaking from experience as well, because I remember uh, trying to chase and build up capacity as the world was recovering in 2010, right? In 2008, in 2009, everyone's cutting capacity and so on, and suddenly everyone needed the equipment back again, and it was crazy, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't help but also think back to something. Yeah, I just can't help but think that maybe the situation would be better if companies were focusing more on resilience and anti-fragility rather than
Mm,
efficiency. Yeah, I mean the whole idea of, I mean, I can get the idea
mm,
that companies had to cut down their employee
mm,
headcount and so on
mm,
in order to save the company. But
mm,
I think that's also a symptom of not having enough buffer from the
mm.
beginning, right? And I think at the start of COVID, when U.S. airlines were badly hit,
Yep.
and there was talk that the airline leaders wanted the government to pump in some money to help
Mm, mm, mm.
support their operations. There
Yep.
was anger as well on the street saying that, hey, you guys were paying so much dividends, right? And over the
Right.
years and not
Mm,
having enough cash on the balance sheet. And now that there's no demand for flights and you're asking for money from taxpayers, how is that
mm.
right? So I think yeah, so it just comes back to the idea that when you're trying to optimize for efficiency, and in this
Mm,
case, when you are keeping lesser cash on a balance sheet, you're trying to optimize for the return on equity, right?
yep.
The lesser assets you
Mm,
have, all things equal, the higher your return on equity.
mm,
And trying to optimize for that, they sacrifice some elements of resilience and anti-fragility. And so when this black swan type of event like COVID happened,
mm.
these airlines were just unable to um withstand any of these shocks that they were facing.
Yeah. I'll take the other side of the argument. I see where you're coming from, given what has happened so far, and I definitely agree about bailouts and so on, because anytime there's a bailout, then it's always a very sticky situation where people point towards, why are you paying your executives so much? Why were you paying so much dividends? Were you actually spending, upkeeping all this assets and investing correctly, right? So a lot of questions will be raised, and rightly so, right? But on the other hand, I think that um, when there's probably a lot of peer pressure as well, because this idea of precision railroading, right? It spread across the entire industry, became really popular, and it's just when you have a competitor who's optimizing and performing way better than you are, then I think that there's going to be pressure for you to also adopt the same practices, right? To reduce your efficiency and so on. Railroads themselves, they do have an advantage. I think they're about, if I remember correctly, about 4 times cheaper than trucks. No one's building railroads anymore, and they tend to be pretty stable growers. I own shares of Canadian National Railway, and you know there's sort of two driving factors for the revenue itself. One is the what you call the volume of goods measured by revenue uh, ton miles. So the revenue you generate over a certain distance, and then the next measure will be real freight per RTM. RTM meaning revenue ton miles. So that would be sort of uh, the price you charge for all these items. And what I see is the RTM, based on our, this is a bit old, but just to give you a sense, RTM tends to grow at 3%, and real freight per RTM is going to grow at around 4%. So you have a compounded, growth of maybe 7 to 8%, right? And I think that the inherent advantages allows them to just gradually increase these prices, and if you can sort of like be more efficient, then that's how your profit grows. But you know, I guess any concept taken to the extreme will have its deficiencies, and it's arguable whether or not a pandemic itself, which is such a abnormal event, right? Should you be planning for pandemics in the future and be less efficient? Therefore, I think still an open question. Or should you be holding more cash on hand? In the case of, I think, Lululemon and Apple, even though they face supply chain issues, I would imagine they optimize as well. But because they have cash on hand, they have that buffer to be able to do freight, air freight, and so on. So many ways to think about this. I don't think that it's as straightforward, given an alternate universe and so on. Anyway,
Yep.
uh,
One last thing sorry,
yeah.
go on. You were saying?
No, continue.
No, just one last thing. Just one last comment on this. You mentioned the idea about peer pressure,
Right.
and it's interesting because the 2019 Wall Street Journal article that I mentioned earlier,
Mm-hmm.
it mentioned Burlington Northern Santa Fe, or BNSF, which is a
Mhm.
railroad owned by Warren Buffett's Berkshire
Mhm.
Hathaway.
Yep.
And I think I can't confirm, but it seems as from the Wall Street Journal article that BNSF does not really practice precision scheduled railroading. So
Yep.
if it really did not, or rather, if it's really the case where BNSF is not practicing
Yep.
precision scheduled railroading, then I think it's really on brand for Buffett, because he is just one of those iconoclastic business leaders who just does not give in to peer pressure.
Well, on the other hand, he did partner 3G, so I mean, they are. If you want to talk about like optimization and cutting costs, 3G is probably the poster child for that.
I think there's a reason why, after the initial flurry of excitement over 3G, I think when Buffett first worked with 3G, in the subsequent years, you hardly hear him mentioning 3G. I think there's probably a reason for that.
Yeah, but I think that Canadian National Railway also did. I do remember a few years ago the CEO got fired. You know that they got fired when they have nothing nice to say about the CEO on the departure. Otherwise, they'll put out some token message saying thank you very much and so on, right? So in this case, I think it was quite clearly he was fired, and he was fired because of customer problems and so on. So they actually put the guy who was in charge of marketing and sales as the CEO, and I think they've righted the ship so far. But then again, I think that they're probably hitting the limits of precision railroading, and they're probably seeing some wisdom after the COVID, to leave some buffer and allow all this sort of or not to put too much stress on the operations to the point where it's not able to respond to this even the smallest wrinkle. Not to say that the pandemic was small, but there you go.
Yep.
Okay.
I think that's enough of this particular topic. So I'd like to throw the ball over to you.
Yep. So I was we were talking internally about Dinopost, not internally, but more among our friends, right? And
That's right.
at the same time, I was reading up on tractor supply and catching up, and there was a question from my friend Jerry, who was asking about what sort of patterns do we see.
Sorry, our friend Jerry.
Yeah, our friend, not my friend. No, he's my friend. I want to take all his time.
You want to be selfish, eh?
Yeah, I don't want to share. No, I'm kidding. So I think he had a really good question, because I did sort of made an offhand remark that I couldn't see the normal patterns I could see in many of the successful sort of offline retailers which I typically follow. And to be fair, I do not know a lot about Dinopost. They probably have a lot of layers, which I have not unpeeled and discovered yet. But I think the bigger question here is sort of what sort of patterns do I see in successful companies who are able to be offline and not be condemned or be destroyed by Amazon, right? So I'm gonna rattle off 5 points, and hopefully we don't drag this out. It will be fast. So I think the first thing I see is really membership. Tractor Supply has 25 million members in their neighbors club, and for members, I think that the valuable part of it is the data itself, right? You get to see what sort of patterns or who your customers are, right? Imagine if you're a supermarket. The problem with the supermarket versus an online retailer is that the supermarket do not know who actually enters that supermarket, because nobody, unless during COVID times, which I actually thought was a opportunity for them, but where you have to scan before you enter the supermarket. You don't really have to scan, you don't really have to identify yourself. Whenever you enter the supermarket doesn't know who you are, it has no idea of what profile you has. But when you enter Amazon site, they know exactly who you are, what you have bought before, and what you're interested in, right? So that sort of data, I think it's really useful, especially for companies like Tractor Supply, where they're supplying things like livestock, so imagine if a customer buys chickens or chicks, you would immediately know after that what sort of items that the customer will need. They'll need animal feed, they'll need chicken coops, they'll need twine, and all the different things which are needed for breeding and chickens and so on. So you sort of then become the customer of choice because of what you know and how you can market to the customer throughout not just that initial buy, but throughout that life cycle of that livestock itself, right? Which could stretch on for years, and that creates recurring revenue, which we like so much. I'm going to pause here for any comments.
None so far. Please carry on.
Okay. The other example I have was, of course, Costco. Costco, they do earn everything, their profits. I would consider it primarily from membership fees itself. Everything else, the way Costco operates is that they will buy items. The specialty here is that they focus on a very select sort of variety of items. So I believe it's around 4,000 versus a Walmart, which can go to 150,000 to 250,000, right? So Costco just focuses on very a narrow band of products, and because of that, they are able to drive really high volume and become the largest supplier of wine or the largest buyer of premium cashews, even though their revenue is probably around 1/4 of that of Walmart. Because they focus on a very narrow band of items, they are able to drive extremely high volumes. And the way they charge is really to just do a cost plus, where they charge, I think, was it 14% and 17% depending on the type of item?
Thereabouts.
And that is primarily to cover the cost of selling that item to a person. And whatever they earn is really from the membership itself, right? So members have to pay a certain membership fee, and that is the profit which Costco actually earns. So I think membership is one way you can protect your business. For the case of Tractor Supply, I should mention that their 70% of their sales actually comes from members, which tells you how much or how recurring its revenue can be. The second point of which I think that is becoming much more prevalent, I'm going to rattle off a number of acronyms here. There's BOPIS, which is buy online and pick up at store. You buy something online and you pick up at store. There's something called BOSS, which is buy online and ship to store. If the item is not available in store, you can ship it to the store. There's even something called ROPIS, ROPIS, which is reserve online, pay in store. And I think that is more for items where you would like to sit down and ask more questions. So you can reserve that item, but when you get there, you'll be able to consult, compare, the products, get a feel of it before you actually buy it, right? There's also Boris, Boris, which is buy online, return in store, which I think that physical stores will do much better. And the last one I think is something which emerged during COVID, which is curbside delivery, where you're able to buy online and then just drive up to the curbside of the store and have the customer actually load it into your trunk, or the store load it into your trunk. So looking at all of these different channels, they're all channeled towards providing convenience to the customer, right? The common denominator here is the customer, and providing them with different ways to engage with you. And that can actually provide, I think, more data to the customer itself. And I think that this is not something which online companies, even like Amazon, can produce. I think 70% of Tractor Supply's items are actually picked up in store. So that going through that bullish road. So again, I'm going to pause for any comments.
No. So so you mentioned about Dinopost. So
Yep.
I have actually spent some time looking at the company, and I don't. And it's interesting because it's a company that has managed to grow by like 30% or so, annualized run rate for revenue over the past decade or so. So very impressive. Sorry, since 2014. So very impressive growth, and it has actually, as far as I know, not had much or any form of online sales as well, and it also does not have any form of membership. So yeah, so like I think a lot of what you mentioned so far applies to perhaps situations where that population density is sparse. Whereas if you are operating a retail store that is located really near where people stay, which is the case of Dino, then I think it can be as simple as just having really cheap products, a good variety of really cheap products in the store, and keeping the store clean and well maintained. Yeah, but yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I think you're right, because there are stores locally, there's Ser Jing in Singapore, and which has maybe 1% online sales, and then there's I think in US there's Ross stores and TJ Maxx, which has no online sales at all. So there are definitely companies which have done well despite not having all this memberships or online sales. I do think that Dino, just from their initial impression, they probably do a lot of things which are not easy, which it's not visible easily unless you study it closely. So I'll give you an example of what Costco does, right? They used to pack their cashews in sort of cylindrical containers, and then they decided to change it to square containers, because with square containers you'll be able to fill in more cashews, but then lower the height of the container itself, right? And if you lower the height of the container, you'll be able to stack more of this containers on a pallet, and you get to transport more, and you save on the should I call it logistic cost per container, right? So I think there are all these very tiny things which and thousands of decisions to cut costs, which you don't necessarily see as a consumer, and all this happens behind the scene. And just from my initial impression, I feel that Dinopost probably does a lot of that. I did see one where they the way they display their items are all in very standardized boxes, where I think the unloading and display of the items itself is really optimized and really stripped down to the bare essentials, really. So I'm gonna rush through the next three. The third will be exclusive products and house brands. I think the person who does well in this is Ser Jing. They have house brands for daily necessities, which attract people. House brands tend to be higher margin because you do not have to share your margin with someone else, and they tend to be cheaper as well. And I think what the smart thing which Ser Jing did here was to base it on essential items, right? So other people will not be able to copy their house brands and their costs. And that I think becomes a sort of crowd puller to attract people to their store. Exclusive products, I think, are pretty self-explanatory. But I'll pause here if you have any comments.
Again, this is something that Dino does not do. So most of Dino's sales actually come from as far as I know, third-party brands. So it could be regional, it could be multinational brands, and private label products actually account for only a small minority of its overall revenue. So again, a very interesting contrast, right?
As Jerry said, these could be, if you flip it around, Jerry being Jerry, he's optimistic. You could see these as opportunities instead of them lacking something, right? The next point is pretty close to what I just said. It's the fresh produce and livestock. I think these are traditionally not done well when you do it online. People like to look at the products itself. Sheng Siong does this really well, where I think I want to say like more than a third of their sales comes from fresh produce, and it's very obvious when you walk into their stores. So you have seafood, you have vegetables. Tractor Supply sells livestock, and I think that all these items are typically not provided by the likes of Amazon. And you could tell that probably Amazon is thinking that, if you want to enter groceries, you need to buy Whole Foods, which they did. Yeah. So I'm gonna pause here again.
Nope.
Okay, last one. Last one I think is something which Ulta Saloon does, which is to provide on-site services. So Ulta Saloon is a cosmetic retailer. The interesting thing about Ulta Saloon is that they are able to still grow despite Amazon, and I think it's partly the nature of their products, which are cosmetics, which from a logistics point of view actually is much easier to handle because these are not items which expire really fast. But from a vanity point of view, I think that no one wants to buy some cosmetic which you're going to put on your face, and I think when it comes to stuff which you put in your mouth or your face, you tend to be a bit more careful with that. So I think those are the items which are sort of maybe by its nature itself makes it a bit more resilient compared to stuff which you can find on Amazon. But what Ulta Saloon does also is they provide haircuts, they provide nail polishing services, they provide all these services which you can only do on site, right? You can't order a haircut online, at least not yet.
I would love to one day.
Yeah, maybe that. I don't know how that's gonna happen, but anyway, I think that these services may not necessarily be the highest margin because you have to hire people, and it's one-on-one, right? One hairdresser to one person, right? But I think the presence of such services really provides that closer touch and provide a service which, if you're going to go to the store for a haircut, you might as well pick up some items too, right? So I think that acts as a incredible draw for things which, Amazon cannot do online. Tractor Supply has things like pet washers, Veneton, vets, and all sorts of services which you can only do offline. And I think this becomes sort of an activity which attracts people to come over. Costco has $1.50 hot dogs, so Lululemon has yoga classes, right? So there's all this sort of activities which you can't do online, basically.
Yep. I can see a parallel in Dino. It sells fresh meat, which is somewhat rare in some of the what they call discount grocery chains in Poland. Most of its competitors sell frozen meats, whereas in the case of Dino, it sells fresh meat, and it has its own in-house meat processing plant, so it's able to get fresh supply of meat on a daily basis.
That could be a huge one because I think from our own experience between frozen chicken and fresh chicken now, I think that I'm referring to Singapore, by the way. Malaysia just banned chickens from being exported to Singapore. So I think I'm gonna end the podcast here because my daughter just walked in. But see
I
you
love
guys
it.
around. Sorry. Bye.
Bye.